My name is Jeff Harris, and I am a physician and an epidemiologist. So I'm the chair of the Department of Health Systems and Population Health in the School of Public Health, and we have about 170 employees and about 450 students. And we have students at the undergraduate level, and then a huge number at the master's level, and then a few at the PhD level as well. So I just finished a thing that I'm really proud of, actually. The American Heart Association decided, we've been talking about equity and anti-racism. What is it that employers can actually do? And so we produced kind of a manifesto and a guide of 20 things that employers can do if they really are serious about equity. So, about hiring practices in the workplace, but also saying to large employers, if you're really serious about this, then let's talk about the stuff out there in the real world that you need to lobby for. So how about universal preschool? So that we give everybody a chance to get a running start. And also, what about expansion of Medicaid so that everybody has health insurance? The fundamental things that really keep us from having equity or health equity in this country, since the lack of health insurance is the single largest cause of bankruptcy in the United States. So, my parents were both children of the Depression, and they also had rental houses and an apartment house that they had, and when we were little, that just meant that they were gone a lot, taking care of that stuff. When we were older, we were the maintenance people. So my brother and I were doing the yard work and doing things like changing 500 air conditioning filters in this unit. Not 500, I'm sorry, 50 air conditioning filters in this unit. I worked for my uncle picking watermelons in the summer, and I then had a job clearing land for a summer, and then I had a job working at a gas station for a summer, and then I had another job selling hot dogs for the Texas Rangers, actually, when the first summer that I moved to Arlington, Texas. So it was busy, and my parents worked a lot, and we worked a lot. So when I was 11, we drove through, it was either Alabama or Mississippi, I frankly don't remember which one, and we stopped at a restaurant to eat, and it was a decent restaurant. It was well lit and air conditioned and clean, and then I needed to go to the bathroom, and so I went and realized that there was a whole other restaurant in back that wasn't well lit or air conditioned. There were just screens, and there were these things that hang from the ceiling that they catch flies with, and they were just covered with flies. And that restaurant, of course, was for the black people in that town, and we were eating in the white part, and they were eating in the black part, and it made a big impression on me because it was wrong, and it wasn't the way my parents had raised me either, and I'd just never seen anything like that before. So I started first grade when I was 5, and then the schools weren't very good in that neighborhood, and they wanted me to go to a private school in Fort Worth, Texas, and the lowest grade they had was 3rd. So I skipped 2nd. So that meant that from then on, I was always 2 years younger than my classmates. And because I'd gone to a private high school, the University of Texas at that time had a policy of taking just about everybody who applied, and then the policy was to flunk a lot of them out. If you had a good education, they had to figure out where you needed to be placed. And so I took a bunch of placement tests, placed out of 2 years worth of college. And so I basically started as a junior. And so I began interviewing for medical school when I was 17. You can imagine everywhere that I interviewed, they had a psychiatrist interview me because they were trying to figure out whether or not I was sane, the 17-year-old kid who wanted to go to medical school. And so I then started when I was 18 and finished 4 years later when I was 22. I've always been very interested in immigrants' rights. One of my transformative experiences in medical school was caring for an undocumented man who had a really unusual infection of his brain that he'd probably acquired in Mexico, and he didn't have any health insurance. And he had one of these unusual infections that I was really interested in. It was a parasitic infection, and I sent the specimens off to the CDC, and I got to know him and his wife really well because he spoke only Spanish and I spoke Spanish, and that wasn't that common among the medical students, and met them. But I also heard that he had been billed full price for all the care that he received, and that they were garnishing his wages, and that they were sending bill collectors to his house. And so I hadn't really been an activist on universal health insurance and the importance of health insurance until then, and then it was just so real to me. I could, it's why I've always been, since then, a big advocate for universal health insurance and for immigrants' rights. Between my third and fourth years of medical school, and it was something that I had worked hard to set up. I actually sat down with an IBM Selectric and wrote letters to all these places all over Latin America. And so the folks in Guatemala said they would take me, and I was working at a hospital that's about an hour out of the capital city that served almost completely Highland Maya Indian patients who came from all around. They would come, and I took care of 5 children who died of a combination of measles and malnutrition that summer. And it wasn't because of the care we were providing. I was well supervised. There were physicians that had come down from New York to supervise the medical students. It was because the kids were getting an infection they shouldn't have gotten. We've been vaccinating against measles for 10 years at that time in the United States. After the 5th one of these children died, I actually got on a bus and went into the capital city and went to the U.S. Embassy and talked to a doctor who was working there and said, I want to do prevention. I don't really want to get these, get patients when they're so far down the pike and there's not much I can do for them. I want to work on preventing things upstream. And what should I do? And he said, well, you need to go to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and go into this program called the Epidemic Intelligence Service, or EIS. And that's what I ended up doing later on. I finished medical school and I finished my residency, but then I went to CDC and I became what's known as an EIS officer, Epidemic Intelligence Service. So Judy and I met in New York when we were at the pre-internship picnic. So we were both interns and residents at Columbia Presbyterian in Washington Heights in Manhattan in New York City. She was like the first person I talked to. I don't know why. I was taken with her at that point. I don't know how she felt about me. Internship is hard, and Judy was always buoyant and positive, and I'm not sure I was always so buoyant and positive. And so I was really taken with her. And then I think we started dating about halfway through that year. And then we moved in with each other the summer after our internship. Judy has a much better pedigree than I do. Judy is Judy Wasserheit, my wife, my long-term partner. Judy went to Princeton undergrad. She was in the 2nd class of women who graduated from Princeton. And then she went to Harvard Medical School. So we got married in the Princeton Chapel in Princeton, New Jersey. This is my son Ash, by the way.
Hi.
Hi.
Mark Weber and Susie. Yes. But it's okay, they'll edit. So, works. He's a video game designer, so he works from home. But he's moving soon. He's moving to Redmond. So I was an Epidemic Intelligence Service officer, EIS officer for CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. I ended up being sent on an outbreak of cholera, and it was in Truk in the South Pacific. There were several thousand people who had cholera. Truk is a lagoon. It was the site of a big battle in World War II. And so because it's a lagoon, the water doesn't flow in or out very much. And so there was a group of people who came from another part of the South Pacific called Yap, and they came on a ship, and several of them developed cholera, and then they came and they dumped their sewage into the lagoon. And then the people in Truk, they're called Truckees, ended up getting cholera. So there were a lot of cases, and the World Health Organization was there as well, and we were able to use intravenous solutions and then something called oral rehydration solution, which is a mixture of sugar and salt, and we were able to really keep the death rate down, so that was good. My wife received an infectious disease fellowship at the University of Washington, and so I broke protocol and followed her here, and that's how I worked for the state health department here in the old Smith Tower, actually in downtown Seattle, for 2 years from 82 to 84. They had changed the law on fireworks in the state, and so fireworks that were pretty hard to get before because they were illegal firecrackers and bottle rockets, they had made them legal all of a sudden. So we did a study. We went back and went into emergency rooms and counted up cases of what happened the year before they changed the law, and then we did the same thing the year after they changed the law. Both of these were during the July 4th holiday, and we documented that burns were up and lost eyes were up and lost fingers were up, and we published it in a journal called the Journal of the American Medical Association, which is a big prominent journal, on July 4th, and the legislature looked at that information and decided to change the law back. So I was sort of hooked on doing policy work after that point. I realized that doing policy work and that kind of stuff made a difference. So I worked for CDC for 20 years, but I probably more than anybody I've ever heard of did a bunch of different things. I mean, I lived in Bangladesh for a couple of years, and I worked in Washington for several years, and I only spent about half that time in Atlanta working for CDC in Atlanta, which was fairly unusual.
In 1984 through 1986, you and Judy lived in, is it Matlab, Bangladesh?
We lived in we worked in a village called Matlab, which is a village of about 10,000 people, and we actually lived there because we were working out there during the work week, and then we would go home to the capital city on weekends. It was a village of about 10,000 people. You could only get there by boat at that time, so we would go for about an hour in a Land Rover kind of thing, and then we would get on a Boston whaler and go the last hour by boat. 80% of Bangladesh is less than 30 feet above sea level, so it's very wet during the monsoon season. It was interesting to be there. We were the only foreigners living there. We spoke Bengali pretty fluently. For our first 6 weeks in Bangladesh, we actually lived in a monastery down in southern Bangladesh and studied Bengali about 10 hours a day with native Bengali speakers. And so we were, and I had a chance to practice it all day long because I was doing surveillance in this. So I was working on a huge cholera vaccine trial, about 120,000 people that we vaccinated. And I was the person who was in charge of trying to find cases of cholera. We had no idea who'd been vaccinated and we did know, but I didn't know. And so we were trying to detect the cases of cholera and see whether or not the vaccine was protected. So I went around by boat all the time to these various health centers, and we would do swabs to check and see whether or not people had cholera infection. Because it was a small town, there was electricity during the day to keep the sort of light industry going. Things like the person who was the haberdasher or whatever made clothes. But at night, about 6 o'clock, the power would go out. So Judy and I lived in this little cinder block house. We would just kind of lie there because batteries were not very good and they were very expensive, and they were hard to get. And kerosene lamps made us sick because they smelled really bad. And so we would just kind of lie there and talk to each other. Because we were unusual, we were sort of constantly being observed. Bangladesh was a pretty conservative Muslim country at that point, still is. When we would go out, there were no public displays of affection. We would never hold hands. When we would go on vacation, we held hands a lot because we couldn't do it when we were in our village in Bangladesh. So Judy was working on family planning with these amazing women that were called Lady Family Planning Visitors. So these are women with an 8th grade education who would go door to door and talk to women about contraception. Often without their husbands knowing it, actually. And it was an amazing story, an amazing, women's development story. And Judy wore a sari because that was what was appropriate. But so we were busy during the day, and we had lots of friends during the day, but we were kind of alone at night because I think people didn't quite know what to do with a couple.
In 1986, you're back in the States working on global response to the HIV/AIDS pandemic. What was it like to return to civilization, so to speak, and especially in Washington, D.C.?
Well, we actually lived in Baltimore because Judy was on the faculty at Johns Hopkins and I was commuting to D.C. every day by train. I think that the weirdest thing about coming back was the plenty and the choice, and going to the grocery store and just realizing, that there were 10 kinds of cereal or whatever, whereas there really had just been one in Bangladesh. And so that was the strangest thing in terms of culture shock. When I came back to the U.S. and I went to work for the U.S. Agency for International Development, which is the foreign aid agency of the U.S. government, I was on loan from CDC, or on assignment from CDC, and I had been hired as their diarrheal disease research person, because that's what I'd been doing, right? I'd been working on cholera and typhoid, and they told me when I started the job, they said, there's this thing called AIDS, and we're not quite sure what it is. I mean, I'm trying to remember whether or not we actually had discovered HIV at that time. I'm not sure. But there's this thing called AIDS. We'd like you to be our AIDS coordinator, but it's only going to be a 1 day a week thing, and we think it's going to go away. And so, of course, within a year, I had given up diarrheal diseases, and I was working on AIDS full time. And so I was the AIDS coordinator for USAID for 6 years. And it was in the early days of the pandemic, and there was no script. And we were working with the World Health Organization, and we debated whether the focus should be on preventing sexual transmission or bloodborne. And I argued pretty strongly it should be on sexual transmission, because I thought that's what was really driving things. And it turns out that was right. And that is what we focused on. So I traveled probably 50-60% time for 6 years, and was in Africa a lot, but I was also in Geneva a lot at World Health Organization, and I went to London with the C. Everett Koop, the Surgeon General, to a Minister of Health summit. So I was 29 when I started this job, and I think they gave it to me because they had no idea what a big deal HIV was. It wasn't because I was so remarkable, but because they didn't realize how remarkable HIV was, and it was an amazing time, and an amazing opportunity for a young person to be at the center of something that turned out to be really important. Well, I think this was honestly, this was a coming of age for me. I mean, when I took this job, I didn't know very many gay men or gay women, lesbian women, and I probably had about the standard dose of homophobia for a young guy that had grown up in Texas as a cisgendered heterosexual. It was a time of real growth for me, but it was I won't say that I didn't have a lot of growing to do, because I did. And I think I think the people that I worked with recognized that I had a lot of growing to do, and they did a lot to try to educate me and give me an opportunity to learn what was what, and that. So I think the things that I have always been interested in are prevention. I've always been a prevention guy. That one of my favorite quotes, and I didn't get this quote until I've been working in prevention for quite a while, but is by a guy named Richard Feynman, who's a physicist who ironically worked on the atomic bomb. But Feynman said that it takes only a flash of energy to scramble an egg, and once you've scrambled it, all the energy in the world can't unscramble it. And that, I think, encapsulates for me why prevention is so important, because why would we want people's lives to get scrambled by disease or by injury if we could prevent it? My mission has always been to really try to keep people from getting sick, and to try to figure out ways that do that at scale. So I've always been about, and that's why I love policy, because that's how you do that at scale. You're not going to do it through changing hearts and minds one at a time, although that's important. So been committed to racial justice for a long time. Judy and I have started a scholarship fund at the University of Washington, one in her department in the School of Public Health, and one in mine for underrepresented students. So we now have 8 scholarships a year for underrepresented students, and we're the ones who set that up. So really loved Seattle. We had lived here in the 80s, and we had always been trying to get back here. So Judy was offered a job at the Hutch, and I really followed her. I mean, Judy and I taken turns. She followed me to Bangladesh, and I followed her to Seattle. I followed her to Seattle twice. So we've kind of traded off in terms of our careers. At the University of Washington, my focus has really always been on research. I teach, and I love teaching, and it's important to me. But I'm, but the University of Washington is what's called an R1 university, or Research 1 university, because research is what it's about. And so I came here to do research. I had been doing work on on prevention and in employed populations. And so I actually went back and got a Master of Business Administration because I wanted to learn about how business people think, because I'd never really learned much about business. Probably the thing that brings me joy day in and day out more than anything else is the woman I've been married to for 40 years. We're best friends. We still never seem to lack for something to talk about. We still go on long walks at least a couple of times a week. Went on one yesterday. Hopefully we'll go on one this evening. And she's my best friend and partner, and so she probably brings me joy more than anything else. I love to learn more about photography. I like photography, but I'd like to get better at it. I love traveling. I still want to see all the national parks if I can, and hopefully get back to doing international travel once COVID dies down. I do realize how lucky I've been. I mean, I do realize how fortunate I've been. I mean, I have parents who cared about me a lot. I mean, I don't have them anymore. But it was clear that I was raised in a family that really valued education, and I married this amazing woman when I was all of 25 years old, and we're still together. And that's probably the most important thing that ever happened to me was marrying Judy Wasserheit. And I've had fascinating work to do, and I have had the privilege of doing stuff that other people don't get to do, which is to do stuff where I really do think it does make a difference. It was a revelation for me that not everybody gets to do that, and that I was really lucky that I'd gotten to do that with my life. And so I do realize how lucky I've been.